Congress. Joining us now from Capitol Hill, Representative Brad Sherman, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, also a ranking member of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Capital Markets. Representative Sherman, thanks for giving us your time.
Good to be with you.
As far as tonight, I don't know if you heard the last caller, but when it comes to issues of Israel, what do you expect the president to say about that tonight?
I expect him to say that we need to stop the fighting. He has proposed and the Egyptians and the Qataris, he's got everybody together, including Israel, to accept the idea of a 6-week ceasefire, together with a release of a substantial number, hopefully all of the hostages. It's only Hamas that refuses to do that, and I think that he'll remind us of that. But there's no magic way for a president to wave a wand and create peace in the Middle East.
I don't know if you heard the caller, but the caller referenced the president's action as taking sides. What do you think about that sentiment? Is that going to be a concern for the president, especially as he seeks re-election? Well,
the American people have taken sides. 80% are with Israel, 20% are with Hamas. It's hard not to look at the death and destruction brought by Hamas. They initiated this on October 7th, and not take sides. And as I watch the State of the Union, I get to have one guest in the gallery, and my ticket will go to a woman whose daughter was taken hostage on October 7th, thank God released in that first hostage release. And I think the entire country wants to see peace in Gaza, but to get a permanent peace, you've got to get Hamas out of there. After all, Hamas is saying if they get a ceasefire, that's just to regroup so that they can do October 7th a second, third, fourth, and fifth time.
As far as comments that you're expecting from the president tonight on Ukraine, what would you like him to say?
That the Ukrainians need our help, and they need it today. And we need to pass the Senate bill today to deal with the humanitarian problems in Gaza, but also in Armenia and Ethiopia and Tigray, that we need to provide aid to the Ukrainians and to Israel and to Taiwan. There's problems in the world, and they're being held up just for political reasons. We've got to pass that supplemental bill.
And as far as the likelihood of ever seeing the light of day in the House, what would you rate that as of today?
Oh, I think it's got, you have a bill that would pass overwhelmingly if we had a vote on it. At some point, we will get a vote on it. And I suspect that will not be till April. That is well past when the Ukrainians need the aid. I think that there are already battlefield losses and dead Ukrainian soldiers as a result of the delay of a bill that should have been passed late last year.
If no action is done on either of those fronts, what is left for the administration to do outside of acting with Congress, and are you comfortable with the administration taking steps on its own?
There are certain steps that the administration can take. The administration may be able to transfer certain of our weapons to Ukraine or to Israel, but without the money to replace those, that isn't good for our military and our national security. What we need to do is pass that bill, and I think ultimately there'll be a discharge petition. That is a slow process. What we need is to put the pressure on Speaker Johnson to put the bill on the floor. You've got a bill that well more than 2/3 of the House would vote for, and the vast majority of the American people will support.
When it comes to bills being passed, how did you vote yesterday on the package of appropriation bills that was ultimately passed by the House?
Oh, I think virtually every Democrat voted yes. Roughly half the Republicans voted yes. We need to keep our government open. We're a laughing stock in the world the way we come right up to the edge to shutting down the government, or last year came right up to the edge to dishonoring our debt. We have to compete for capital in a world economic system, and Washington is not a good advertisement for the stability and sanity of the United States.
And as far as future appropriations bills being passed on time and without a partial shutdown, what's your level of confidence in that?
I'm about a 60-70% likelihood that we can pass the rest of the bills by March 22. It'll be harder than the first group. We passed the easy 6. Now we've got to deal with the harder 6. I think we do it Maybe there is some further delay beyond that, but this is not a way to run a government. Speaker Johnson has got to find, when a bill has overwhelming support, he has to let us vote on it.
The harder portion, the harder 6, why is it harder?
Because we've deliberately delayed some of the more controversial bills to the second package. We ate our dessert first, and there are a number of contentious issues, chiefly over the spending levels. Also, the Republicans have not given up on some of their anti-choice riders or anti-gun control riders that they like to stick on these bills.
Because you're the ranking member of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Capital Markets. Jerome Powell was on Capitol Hill yesterday, reiterated efforts to try to get inflation down to 2%, expressed concerns over the outlook of the economy in order to do that. Ultimately, do you think we'll ever get to a point where we're at 2%?
We're at 2.4% last year, and that is damn close to 2%. I think that it's now time to start cutting interest rates, which are not captured in that 2 or 2.4% figure. The cost of a home mortgage is not included when we calculate the cost of living, but of course, it's part of the cost of living.
And so as far as the economy is concerned, that's expected to be talked about by the president tonight. What would you like him to say as far as his economic outlook, his economic desires in this last year and a potential second term?
Well, the president can't just say, finish the job. He's got to lay out an ambitious agenda for the next 4 years beyond what he proposed 3.5 years ago. And I hope it includes regulating, not just negotiating the price of a few drugs, but regulating the price of all drugs. We're paying triple what much of the world is paying for pharmaceuticals, and we ought to pass legislation so that the drug companies get a fair price that reflects the risks that they take when they do the research, but they can't just price a drug at $1 million a year or $100,000 a year and say it's life and death, you have to pay us. No other country allows that. It's time to regulate drug prices, and I think that would be the biggest thing he could do at the federal level to bring down inflation.
One more from your financial services hat, if I may. The SEC yesterday approved a rule that will require some companies to report greenhouse gases. It's getting a lot of reaction. What do you think of the rule, and what do you think the reaction will be amongst those large companies?
I think the companies will comply. I think many of them will like the fact that there's a standardized way, an accepted way to define their greenhouse gas effect. But this is long overdue. I'm an old CPA. The goal is to report to shareholders and prospective shareholders the information that they think is material to their investment decision. And for an awful lot of investors, the greenhouse gas effect of a company is material. And what this will do is will cause American companies to compete for capital by reducing their greenhouse gas effect. This is going to help us in our climate goals.
Representative Brad Sherman, Democrat from California, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thanks for your time this morning on the State of the Union Day.
Good. Thank you.